Hello, everyone. I'm Chinyere Mobi, Community Editor at the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our Health Matters webinar, What Comes Next for Public Safety. We are here today to dig deeper into growing calls to rethink the public safety of our communities in the wake of protests that continue over the killing of George Floyd and so many others, and police brutality and systemic racism against communities of color. Increasingly, advocates, community members, and local officials have been calling to reform, defund, or abolish police departments across the country. The range of proposals is vast, from minor budget trims and calls for more transparency to defunding police departments and reinvesting those funds in a host of community services that can respond during crises and address underlying needs. For some communities, an embrace of change has been swift. The Minneapolis City Council unanimously voted to eliminate the city's police department in favor of a new Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. For other cities, smaller steps have been taken, such as banning chokeholds or exploring proposals to use unarmed civilians for traffic stops. In this webinar, we'll explore the various proposals with the broader goal of helping reporters understand and critically evaluate efforts playing out in their own community. What have we learned from past efforts of police reform, and what's the potential impact of current movements on community health and safety? We'll also get an on-the-ground look into Eugene, Oregon's Cahoots program, which is a collaboration between the city's police department and Whitebird Clinic, a local social services provider. The program, which is getting national attention, responds to 911 calls for mental health and behavioral health crises that do not necessarily require police intervention. Here to help us explore this topic, we're joined by three expert speakers. John Elico is a national correspondent for the New York Times covering race and based in Kansas City. His work documents the nuances of America's struggle with race issues, from the protest movement over police violence to the changing face of the nation's cities and suburbs. Ebony Morgan is a crisis intervention worker for the Cahoots Mobile Crisis Response Team in Eugene, Oregon. Motivated by the death of her father during a police encounter, Ebony joined Cahoots earlier this year. She previously worked as a registered nurse. Philip V. McHarris is a joint PhD candidate in sociology and American studies at Yale University. His research focuses on race, punishment, and policing, drawing on qualitative and quantitative methods. This webinar series is offered thanks to the California Endowment, the Commonwealth Fund, and the National Institute of Healthcare Management Foundation, as well as individual supporters like you. You can tweet about the webinar at the hashtag #CoveringCrisis. And a word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to you, our audience, for questions. Because we have many people participating in the webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions into the questions section of Zoom, not the chat section. You could also write us there if you're experiencing any technical difficulties as well. We'll also be archiving this webinar later this afternoon at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Now let's turn to our panelists. Philip, how do the origins of policing connect to the current conversations around public safety?
Yeah, thanks, Chinyere. So, I think historically, there hasn't really been a clear sort of through line into how do we understand where we came from and how we got here. I think sort of like with other systems like incarceration, there's been sort of a large body of research and writing that has sort of connected the dots with past systems of oppression and exploitation and, present carceral systems. And with policing, the history often, there's so many different histories. And I think that in some ways can lead to confusion around how did we get here? But I think when you look back at the broader history of policing, what we see is that police they weren't designed for public safety. And that's not sort of, just like saying it, it's literally like it wasn't designed for initially for public safety. And one way of telling the history of policing is by telling parallel history. So in the South, we know that it's arguable that the first entity of policing was as slave patrols that were designed to prevent rebellion, to punish and discipline enslaved people who were gathering and sort of to really quell these fears around rebellion and violence towards the broader white public. And that, through time during Jim Crow, and over time, that policing was really sort of on the front lines of enforcing the status quo, and the status quo was shaped by white supremacy. And in the North, the emergence of policing was largely driven by a desire to protect shipping and capital and business interests. And there's other stories like the Texas Rangers in the West, but really what we see over time is that policing largely emerged as a tool of race and class control, and that as people who were marginalized grew in different localities, and also as activism and resistance happened to broader systems of injustice, policing expanded and grew and developed technologies to engage in surveillance and different forms of violence. And so that's sort of like a longer overview to say the way that we got here, and the continued violence that we see disproportionately against Black people, as well as indigenous communities and undocumented folks in various marginalized communities. It's not sort of an aberration. It's actually, when you really look at the history of policing, it wasn't necessarily designed for public. It wasn't designed for public safety, and often as tools to control marginalized people. And so what we see is that, right now, today, a lot of the violence that we see today is not an aberration. It's actually it's baked into the design of these systems over the past period of time.
There are currently calls for police reform, defunding, and abolition. Can you explain what each of these terms mean and what they might actually look like on the ground?
Right. I mean, so traditionally reforms have looked like things like body cameras, a focus on training, strategies like procedural justice, implementing technology as a solution, expanding diversity initiatives, implementing certain policies and restrictions. And what we have seen is that, just for context, the reform era of policing that sought to try to root out the corruption actually begins in the early 1900s. So it's been over 100 years of reforms that have focused on training, professionalism, procedural training requirements. And now this sort of emergence of surveillance, different technologies. And sort of in the 70s, one of the big things that emerged was community policing. That was on the heels of the rebellions in the 60s. And so this has been getting recycled for the past 5 decades. This focus around, we just need community policing. And the same period where this framework was developing was the same period where the war on drugs and mass incarceration was exploding. And so it's not that, these are sort of competing necessarily theories, that community policing and these sorts of efforts actually emerge alongside in order to help preserve the legitimacy of police, especially in moments of crisis. And so reforms have largely focused on officer compliance with certain laws and policies and sort of trainings. And often what we see is that has not stopped violence, and it has in many ways expanded police power in a variety of ways. And Naomi Murakawa has a book, The First Civil Right, that discusses this at length, in the ways in which liberals were, and liberal reformers were sort of at the forefront of expanding mass incarceration and carceral machinery. And so, reform largely sort of historically has focused on efforts to try to change systems in ways that are actually not transformative, or that inevitably end up expanding the system. And we see this sort of with calls recently to expand funding for police, for more training, which has been the sort of logic and the solution for decades. And it was in many ways also after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson. But because of the past few years of organizing and political developing, organizers have been able to shift the conversation to say that actually, what folks want is to stop the violence and to make sure that communities have their basic needs met in alternative forms of emergency response, because this model and this continued sort of investment in these reforms are not actually transforming the systems that are actually doing violence, and that lead to other forms of conflict and violence and harm within communities that lack the resources. And so that's where defunding comes from. And it's actually a part of a broader framework of invest, divest. Oftentimes people just hear the defunding part, but the framework as it's been conceived of historically has focused on divesting from systems of punishment and reinvesting funds in community resources and alternatives to safety. And abolitionists sort of have been at the forefront of conceiving of defunding and divest as a broader strategy. And for abolitionists who want to unearth the entire system of not only policing but the broader prison industrial complex, defunding and divesting becomes a step in that direction. And really the main thing here is that it's not about divesting or abolishing safety or help, but it's actually about reconceiving of ways that actually can guarantee or become closer to guaranteeing safety and accountability in processes that can actually be driven by actual like a desire for public safety, because it's an acknowledgement that the public policing and the broader criminal legal system cannot be reformed to not be violent or to not sort of perpetuate racist and classist actions and policies. And so it's an acknowledgement that the system needs to be unearthed, and that in its place needs to, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore has described, as there needs to be life-affirming institutions, and people need to have their basic needs met, and people need alternatives to safety, because not only do police actively harm particular communities, they actually don't do the job that it's said that they do particularly well either. When we look at like clearance rates, and even what police do, less than the studies show that like potentially 4% of 911 calls even are involving violence. And so most of what police do is not even actually what people imagine that they do. And so really it's also about creating other ways of being safe and responses to harm when it does happen. But the truth is that for some people who don't see the vision of abolition, defunding is something that they can see and that they can ascribe to. And it's an entryway that they can say, yes, these systems have gotten too large at the expense of communities. And some people don't see a vision of abolition yet, or some people might not ever. But a part of what there's alignment on is that these policing has grown and expanded in terms of its power, and that divesting and shifting resources and actually beginning a process of transformation is the way, as opposed to sort of reforms that have largely sort of focused on compliance and expanded police power rather than shifting resources and power.
Thank you. And John, how have calls to reimagine public safety changed in the wake of George Floyd's death? What are we seeing now, and is the momentum shifting in any way?
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot of what Philip was just talking about. I think, if you just look at the most recent history, look at Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed 6 years ago, I think a lot of what we saw come out of that were these more reform-oriented steps. And then you were getting this from even some of the most fervent activists, because at the time, that this was like the first real kind of inflection point, probably since Rodney King was beaten back in '92. And then you had the 2014 come around, and so people were looking to things like body cameras, things like implicit bias training, de-escalation, and those types of things, because that was what was seen as the first step. That was what was seen as a step, and I think you had those efforts going on over the next couple of years. Then obviously we had the election of President Trump in 2016, and I think maybe some of the media attention and some of the more overt attention toward this effort and these efforts to change policing had kind of died down a little bit. But then obviously we had George Floyd, who was killed on Memorial Day, and when we see basically a flaring up of what had started really six years ago. And the thing is, even as that attention on it really went down and was driven down, you still had a lot of these activist groups, a lot of these organizations working on these steps that they ultimately wanted to look toward more of an abolition framework. And so what we're seeing now is it picks up in a new place, right? People, again, are seeing these killings still happening, and they're saying, hey, these reforms just don't seem to be working. And this is all stuff that, within the last 6 years. So it's not like people had to wait, 100 years to see that the reforms didn't work. They're saying, look, 6 years later, the reforms aren't working. So let's look at something else. Let's look at something more drastic. And so what I think you're seeing now, you're seeing much more mainstream attention and much more mainstream effort toward these calls to defund the police. Now, clearly, that is still somewhat of a, I want to say, a complicated message, I think, because I think for many different people, it means many different things. And so I guess we're still seeing some pushback on certain elements of that. Some people wondering, whether it's the right way. You had Karen Bass, the congresswoman who's head of the Congressional Black Caucus, who said like defunding was one of the worst slogans. And so you have these this kind of confusion, and it's not there's nothing that's quite unanimous about it yet. But I think that where you are seeing agreement, and where you are seeing agreement across across many parts of the political spectrum, is a sense that something is fundamentally broken with policing, and how do we fix that, right? And so I think there are some folks who are still advocating more reform, but I think we're seeing much more of a mainstream movement now to say reform is not enough, and at the very least we need to disinvest some and invest more into resources, as I think Philip said, the life-affirming institutions that will then hopefully bring down crime and create true public safety.
Going along with that, what does the polling say? Are Americans in support of defunding, reforming, or abolishing, or are these still seen as more extreme ideas?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you ask the question, right? So generally speaking, so if you just talk about defunding or say defund, the polling might not be as much, there might not be as much support for that. I think the polling has shown there's not been as much support for that. But if you talk specifically about should money be reinvested in things like, these community institutions and things like, jobs, opportunities, and education, things like that, you do get a lot of support from that, from, across racial lines, across, obviously Democrats tend to support that stuff more than Republicans do, but still you have a lot more Republican support than you would have had in years past for things like that. So if you just say defunding generally, again, that's a hard thing for people to put their finger on what that means, and it might sound a little scarier to people. So that may not we have not seen as much support of that in the pollings, but where we have seen support is if you specifically talk about reinvesting and investing elsewhere. Where you do not see much support right now in the polling is if you ask about abolition, and this is again across all racial groups, there's not really much support for abolishing the police outright. And again, we can get into the reasons for that. It's very complicated, but yeah, in that step, I don't think that has come really toward the mainstream acceptance yet.
And can you walk us through some of the ways you've been reporting and tracking these themes over the last couple months?
Yeah, so I think part of it is really looking at, first of all, getting into communities and really understanding the dynamics that are going on in communities and what really animates and motivates people when it comes to these questions of policing. So, for instance, I'm talking to people in Minneapolis. I did a story on the north side of Minneapolis, which is a predominantly Black community there. That's where you have the largest Black population in the city. And it was a decidedly mixed view on what should be done, because none of these are very easy answers. So there's one woman I talked to, for instance, who talked about calling the police on a domestic violence situation, and the police ended up arresting her. She ended up getting put in handcuffs for that. Yet you talk to other folks who who talk about seeing the really large rise in crime there that's happening right now in Minneapolis. There's a lot of shootings, a lot of violence that's going on there, and then people being worried and saying, well, what is the solution without police? So it's on the one hand, you have folks who say, I'm not calling the police anyway because I don't feel like they're going to come serve and protect me. I feel like they're going to come either harass me or arrest me or something worse, right? If I do call the police. So for those people, it's like the idea of defunding or abolishing altogether may not be that radical, because to them, effectively, they already feel like they don't have a police department. They don't have a force to serve and protect them. But you have for others who talk about the rise in crime, and what do you do about that? Is it just going to be some sort of lawlessness if people think that there's no police to come after them if they commit murder or some other sort of crime? There's people who kind of worry about that. And again, that is these are all very complicated conversations, because there's a sophistication to it in the sense that, as I think as Philip has mentioned as well, even if you look at the system right now, it's not stopping a lot of these high crime rates. Crime has both risen and fallen at times when there's been a lot of policing, right? So it's not just so easy as to one say like, you know, more police equals fewer crimes, and more police will disincentivize people who want to shoot or do other things or commit other crimes, right? So it's really understanding in these communities, they're especially Black communities and brown communities that are most affected by this. I've really been trying to look very closely at the dynamics that play there and why this is such a confusing and complicated issue that really goes beyond, you know, some of the platitudes we hear people speaking out and speaking about in political settings. It's very easy in a city council chamber or in the halls of Congress to say something about, you know, policing, we need to respect our law enforcement, or to say the other way around, that, you know, police are terrorizing us and whatnot. It's really easy to say those things, but how those things look on the ground, it's a much more complicated picture. And so what I'm really seeing is people who, on the one hand, they despise the police in many ways, but on the other hand, some of them still also say they can't imagine a world without police. Like, what do we do otherwise? And so that's really a dilemma and a conflict that people are seeing on the streets, on the ground right now.
Thank you. And this is something that any one of you could answer, but based on what we've seen in past efforts at police reform or defunding, what are the main forces that could stymie deeper reforms or overhauls of police departments? And this is for any of you three.
I can give an initial stab at it. I think so police unions are, of course, like the one that a lot of people are talking about, because they have mobilized and organized to develop power in order to prevent sort of basically like anything. And that's definitely like a big one. I think that in the case of Minneapolis, what we see is that because of certain processes, it becomes difficult to enact. Like we recently saw, like the city council coming to a decision that the charter committee has a different sort of ends up with a different decision that can sort of like shape different like sort of outcomes and sort of challenges for navigating what communities decide. And, you know, I think, to be honest, probably the biggest one is an ideological barrier. And I think it's what sort of John was mentioning and some of what I was alluding to before, is that like for decades, you know, we like as a society have been told police stop, you know, violence and crime, and they're based in some ways they're the only ones that can do it, and that they're the only ones that can respond to like situations that are moments of crisis. And so there, again, it's sort of what John was alluding to, is like when people say, okay, so you want to do defunding or like sort of abolition, people don't see the vision, because in many ways the criminal legal system has become a socializer that like it instructs us how to view the world and how to navigate concerns around safety, and what are the legitimate ways and what are, you know, the strategies that people should be using. And in that regard, it has disciplined imagination, as Miriam Kaba has put, that people have a hard time imagining alternatives because we have been given this model for so long that anything else, and we've been told that anything else will lead to lawlessness and like this idea around like chaos and like destruction. And so I think a part of this, and this relates to a lot of different systems and institutions, media included, but what ends up happening is, again, and what John mentioned is like how things are framed. Like if you say removing something without creating something, you know, in its place that is just and democratic and can be effective, if you don't say that part, then people will, you know, say like, I don't see it, or sort of there will be a response. But the framing here is important. And I think, but a big piece of this though is just that ideologically, we've also been socialized into punishment as a model of justice. And that becomes tricky, like punishment, policing, and imprisonment as models of justice. And so it becomes difficult because, especially because of the speed at which this has been injected into the national conversation, like for people who sort of have been doing the work over the past 6 years, for many people, it's a process to even come to really understand how these different things work and different alternatives, and different ways of approaching all of these different conversations. But basically, it's been like a couple weeks where now it goes from the model was like, okay, implement these reforms, and this is the future, to shift away from and begin to shift power and resources away from policing. And so I think, the ideological terrain is structured in such a way. And just for context also, police were not always seen as the stewards of public safety. This is actually a relatively new idea that really took off in the mid 1900s. Before then, they were largely seen as corrupt and sort of corrupt violence workers. But because of recent decades and because of investments in resources and really like a sort of a systemic push towards establishing police as the stewards of public safety, it has become an ideological sort of stronghold that like it becomes hard. But the last thing I'll say around this is that we know from decades of sociological research around collective efficacy that communities, particularly when they have the resources necessary, actually can really reduce and manage violence and conflict and harm within communities. It's the kinds of work that has taken place has been given pennies on the dollar to do, very hard work. And it really hasn't been invested in, both in terms of resources and time, to really conceive of these alternatives. But we do know that it is possible. And so, but it's because this ideological terrain is structured in such a way that these alternatives and this thinking outside of this model, it really scares people because it's a question around safety, and people are told policing equals safety. Even when people feel like that is not true, it becomes confusing because then it's like, well, what is the alternative? So I think that becomes a sort of a major blockade.
Yeah, thank you. And that segues well into hearing from Ebony and Nihai. Can you tell us a little bit more about Cahoots and how this program works?
Yeah, Cahoots is kind of part of that imagining something different. We've been around in the Eugene and Springfield, in the Eugene, Oregon area for just over 30 years at this point. We're a mobile crisis response team. We're made up of a medic and a crisis worker. We respond in our van to nonviolent calls in our area, specifically nonviolent because we are not armed. So that's how we're contracted. Our calls come in through the non-emergency line that takes the police, fire, and ambulance calls. And we're dispatched by the police dispatchers on their radios. We can respond for crisis counseling, de-escalation, mental health concerns, welfare checks, or subjects who appear intoxicated, and try to connect people with the appropriate resource or provide that intervention that will help support them in their next step. And we have no punitive component because engaging with us is completely voluntary. So people don't necessarily have that same fear response or just automatic, like, am I in trouble when we show up? So we have a different kind of approach. We're trained to assess the mental health and medical components of every call from the onset of that call. So we don't take anything just as it's presenting in front of us. We try to figure out how we got here and what would be helpful and where we can go. But we do operate within that public safety network.
And can you give us a sense of the call volumes your organization sees and how often you have to call the police for backup?
Yeah, we respond to about 60 calls a day. In 2019, we responded to around 24,000 calls, which is about 20% of the incoming calls for service in our area. And of those calls, of the 24,000 calls we did, we called for police backup 150 times. So less than 1% of the time, which tells us that the calls that we are being sent to do not need that police response almost all of the time. It can be unarmed and de-escalating and be more of a conversation than it otherwise might. And I think that that's something that really stands out to us, is that we don't have to call that often for another sort of support.
And you could tell us a bit more about how you became involved in this work and what makes it resonate so strongly with you.
Yeah. I was working in the emergency room when I saw Cahoots bringing in clients. Because sometimes if you need that mental health care or medical care immediately, that's where you're going to go. And it occurred to me that there was an alternative to policing. I had no idea. My own trauma with police stems from my father's death when I was 5 and he was 25. He died during a police encounter. So the idea that there was someone else that could respond if you were having a problem really stood out to me. And I find myself every hashtag and every lost loved one to a system that has not yet changed inspires me to keep figuring out how to make it look different. And so I became part of the system that causes so much trauma in an effort to be something different that people could expect to respond. I went through nursing school and found there that systemic racism is present in healthcare in so many remarkable ways, that this passion for public health and community health kind of came together for me on this topic, and figuring out how we can save the lives of human beings and have some equitable resources. And if something's broken, I believe in fixing it. I was fortunate enough to find in my area that someone had done that imaginative work and figured out how else this could look. And so at this point, I just try to talk about it as much as I can to help try to inspire people to realize that this can look different. And we're still a reactionary resource. You know, we haven't fixed the nature of public safety, but in the meantime, it can look a little different.
And can you share a story of a call that you've personally responded to that stayed with you, and what it might have looked like if the police had taken that call instead?
Sure, yeah. There's one call that will always kind of stick out with me. It was, we initially were called for someone on the scene who was pretty upset, to see if we could just provide support and, I think in essence, calm her down. But when we got there, I was listening to what was actually happening, and there was a man in this apartment that was asked to leave and was really upset about it and was threatening some suicidal ideation, and he was armed with a knife, and they were asking for a description from the person next to me, and she described him as over 6 foot tall, really big build. He was a man of color, and he was pretty angry. And I just saw all of the officers just kind of freeze, and they were like, we probably won't go in there. And I just kind of was like, what are we going to do then? And my coworker and I, or my partner and I, opted to try. And I wound up giving him a call. And I said, hey, my name's Ebony. I work with Cahoots. We're just crisis workers. But I'm not going to lie to you, there are a lot of officers out here, and they know that you have a knife. And I'm wondering if maybe we could step away from that knife and you could come out and talk to me, and we could figure out what the next steps are instead of any of us having to deal with them. Can we work on that? And it took some conversation and some trust building. But ultimately he stepped out of that room and then stepped out of that apartment. And I had walked up to meet him, and the officers frisked him to make sure he wasn't armed, as their policy requires. And then he wasn't, and he came with me, and we walked past this parade of officers to get optionally into the back of my van, and we were able to transport him to the appropriate service where he could get the support he needed and figure out what his next steps were. And that will always stand out to me, because I will always remember their reactions and the immediate power I felt to do something different. And it's really hard to know how something would go if it had gone differently, right? Like, I can't tell, and I'm curious, but I do believe from that call and many others that I personally have witnessed, there's some harm reduction in having a crisis response team, and there's some trust that you rebuild in the community. And I think that what I know for sure is that when we respond to a call, there's 0% chance that we're going to shoot you, because we don't have that tool. And so I can't tell you what it would look like if the police had taken the call, but I know that, it's probably a lot different having us show up instead.
Thank you. And Senator Ron Wyden recently announced plans to introduce a bill to the US Senate aimed at bringing the Cahoots response model to cities and towns around the country. But Eugene is a fairly progressive and predominantly white community. Do you think the Cahoots model can work anywhere or only in certain communities? And what do you think are the barriers to kind of scaling this approach to other cities around the country?
I think that the Cahoots model could work anywhere. It's not a cookie cutter program. We couldn't just drop it in any city and expect it to work. It would have to be tailored to the community's needs and requests and populations. But I think that at its baseline, it's beneficial for the community as well as the police departments. We save money, we take a load off of those officers, and there's a lot of responsibilities that they have that just became their responsibility. And if I ask them, they're not always sure why, but they know that they're not trained to do it. So they're grateful for us to be present. So I think there's room for a response like this. One of the barriers that always occurs to me right away is funding, as well as getting the correct people in the community to have interest and be willing to put in the footwork to establish something like this. And we offer consulting, but really what it boils down to is figuring out what the community's needs are and how they can be met by a crisis response team. And also continuing to acknowledge that we're still a reactive resource and we are still operating within this public safety model that we know is not working for all people. So we're not perfect, but I do hope that as a model, we can inspire communities as to what alternatives can look like within public safety, what we could do now versus long-term, and kind of getting that conversation going. I think that there's probably there's certainly a component of privilege in this area when this was started 30 years ago to the people that were sitting around let's just make this look different. Let's do this thing that we want to do. And they did though, and it worked. And so if we can lead by example with that and use that to help other communities have a response that feels good in their community and is trusted by their community, and people can actually have a response when they're in a crisis that they feel safe with, I think that's everything.
Thank you. And this could be answered by any or all of you. What stories would you like to see right now in the media on public safety and policing? What stories would you like to see? What do you see is not being told, and what voices are not getting heard?
Well, I'm curious to hear from the other panelists, just because, as a journalist, I want to hear what y'all experts have to suggest. I mean, one thing I will say, in terms of voices, and I've realized this as I was doing the story that I think it ran last week about North Minneapolis and kind of the complicated feelings there about defunding and then what to do is I think oftentimes we overlook some of the people who are most the police do all these assessments where they find people who have, who are the most likely to either shoot or be shot, right? Those types. The police have all these, and people can, you can argue one way or another whether it's appropriate or not. But I think oftentimes those voices of people who might be involved in situations, who might, for whatever reason, have been involved in criminal activity or whatnot. We know it's all complicated why these things happen. But I think sometimes those voices are missing. I think oftentimes we go to the pastors, we go to the people who it's safe to go to and find out what type of buy-in is needed there. And for me, I just found going around the community and just talking to young men who looked like me, who had certain struggles. One guy who talked about having had many brushes with the law himself and engaging in conduct sometimes that may not want law enforcement around, but he also found in some ways a need for law enforcement. It was just kind of it was a very ambivalent feeling on his part too. So I think getting those folks engaged in this is something that it's harder to do sometimes, because oftentimes hey, when you're talking to someone about talking to law enforcement or talking about issues of law enforcement, I should say, there's often this hesitance because for good reason. I mean, talking to law enforcement can really get you in danger. Talking about, law enforcement strategies, and that can be a dangerous thing sometimes in some communities. So I think getting buy-in from those folks and really understanding, where they come from, I think that's a voice that I would like to hear and see more in terms of all the of all the discussions going on this.
Yeah, I would agree. Like what stood out, sort of just sort of getting the voices of people um, who are often left out. Like there's sort of like a way in which like problems or people who are problems are sort of constructed, and I think that it's everything is much more complicated than that. And I think that, you know, yeah, I think it's just much more complicated. And I think that there's a way in which, um, uh, yeah, I just think there's ways in which that it's so much more complicated. And I think sort of like what stood out with Ebony is um, the piece around like the person that was sort of angry but was able to be it was able to be de-escalated. But a part of that is that a part of it is also that if you have traumatic experience with police and police show up to try to de-escalate you, like that model is, it doesn't even make sense. You're likely to have a very visceral reaction that's shaped by trauma. But a part of that is that I think what stood out to me the most is that those police officers, regardless of whatever race or whatever, um, I'm sure that they believe that this person needed and was deserving of a violent response, that there was no other sort of way to conceive of a route in which it's sort of this logic that some people just need like violence and this violent response and they need punishment and control. And I think shifting away from that framework is really important. And a part of that requires is talking to people that are seen as sort of like the deservers, right? And I think, which is all shaped by broader systems of white supremacy and that define certain people as deserving and that need sort of like violence in particular ways. And I think that another piece too is like how questions are asked is also important. And that oftentimes questions are asked in a way that solicits certain answers. And that really taking a step back and asking, folks that aren't often asked in the kinds of questions. Because if you just go and say, hey, do you want to just remove all the police? What do you think? That's going to solicit a very different response than like, hey, what does it look like to develop teams and responses of people who can respond to particular emergencies in moments of crisis, and to have that be a sort of a real rigorous model. And if it doesn't work, to adjust. And that, for every different situation, you can have a specialized team that can respond to those specific situations to provide the safety intervention necessary. Because the truth is like there's certain, for mental health crisis, there might be a different team of people that should respond to domestic violence. And there might be a different team that if there's a robbery that happens, there might be a different team to respond to that. And we can go down a line of like, okay, what are the responses that make the most sense to particular forms of conflict and violence and harm? And if there's a property dispute, having someone with a gun that has the ability to kill someone, does that make sense to then navigate a dispute about property? And oftentimes we see business owners call the police on people to deal with disputes, and then it cycles out into people being murdered. And I think one ways in which the piece around sort of in sociology and specifically ethnography is called inconvenient sampling. So this idea of like talking and getting input from people who are the most inconvenient to get input from. And that is like one way of really trying to get like what the story is. But, just to sort of close on this point, the Camden model of policing early on in this moment was being touted by many, like by journalists and different political leaders as sort of like an example of what to do. What ended up really happening in Camden is that for austerity measures, there was a department replaced at the metro level that had more resources that basically created like Camden is called the surveillance city because it implemented a whole host of surveillance and sort of like the 21st century different policing strategies. And that when you talk to the certain people, like the chief and certain people, and you see quotes from like that are sort of focusing on, like a particular people saying like, oh yeah, things got better and, this is a model example. And then a reporter reached out to me the other day and said they interviewed some Black people in Camden and got a much different story. But this model sort of began to sort of like, oh yeah, we just need to, have community policing, have police give out ice cream, and like, have more surveillance. But that is not the model that people are conceiving of. But there's a way in which if you ask certain people, and again, this happened over past decades, like police and political leaders will go to particular people in communities to get their sort of approval around certain policies around, okay, we want to do this. What do you think? And they'll go to the people that will agree with them. And so I think a part of this is also that one, it's complicated that to be in tune with that, because it often then also creates like communities, particularly Black communities, as like monolithic. And it's like, well, we got community buy-in from, Miss and Mr. and like, that means that this is what Black people want. And I think that like creating more complicated narratives is really important. And also recognizing that the criminal legal system it socializes people into how to conceive of the world. So even when it does not work in the ways that people sort of know that it doesn't work, it becomes hard to think about alternatives. But there's plenty of alternatives that I think some needs to be scaled up, and others have to get developed. And that there needs to be time that is sort of, people need time to really, and resources to be able to develop these. And I think like looking at the different examples, and I think the last thing is what Ebony mentioned as well around when I conceive of a model of like safety, I think of what are the preventative measures? Like what are the things that we know that reduce moments of violence and conflict and harm? And we know it's resources. It's like when people have resources in different forms of education, across the gambit, like, surrounding, whether it's around, how to resolve conflict, whether it's around consent, that early on having these sorts of educational models can be preventative and sort of serve as interventions. But that when people have their basic needs met, it fundamentally reduces moments of conflict and violence and harm. It's like, it's the thing that is, people are like, well, how do we, it's like when youth have jobs, in employment programs, when there's green spaces in communities, when there's school programs that engage with youth, we know that there's different community programs and initiatives and resources that really keep people safe. And then there's the moments of safety interventions when something does happen. And then there's the responding to moments of harm in ways that can transform the experience, because prisons and punishment and control doesn't stop cycles of harm and violence. It often creates more cycles of it in various ways. So I think telling the stories of the people who are engaged in that work, who are interested in expanding and leveling up, and also, the examples that need to be developed from the ground up, I think is big. Thank
you. And we're going to segue to the Q&A section now. And this first question is for Ebony. How is Cahoots funded? This is from Colleen Williamson. She says, how is Cahoots funded? I know law enforcement officials discuss the need for such programs, but funding those programs never seems to be a focus for states or cities.
The Cahoots program specifically, good question, Colleen, is funded in our two cities. It's different. In Eugene, we're funded through the city of Eugene via a contract with the Eugene Police Department. So we actually take a portion of the police department budget to handle our portion of the calls. The Eugene Police Department budget is around $68 million a year, and we operate with about $2 million a year. Across the river in the sister city next to us, we're funded by a combination of county funding and city funding. So it's kind of a patchwork of funding at this point in order to expand our services to the next city over. It was a lot of conversations, but we have secured that. So at this point, combination of county and city, and really that buy-in, helping them see that it's cost effective for them as well. And that 20% of the calls, they're interested in having us do that because they're able to focus on the other things and they don't have to go to some of the calls that we do.
And for John, as a reporter, this is from Tatiana, forgive me if I mispronounce your last name, but Tatiana Telesnik. And she asks, as a reporter, I often hear rhetoric from police departments about an already existing lack of funding. A police chief told me his department has been defunded for years. Activists have argued the opposite. How do you respond to this argument that police are already underfunded?
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, a couple things, like on a factual basis, if you look at a lot of cities, and it's going to vary from city to city, numbers show that, that numbers of budgets have been going up in certain cities, in Minneapolis, for one example. And the question of underfunding, it all gets back to what the need is of the police department, right? So if you had, I think a lot of what the defund people, activists are talking about is actually taking away some responsibilities from the police. So if the police have to do less, then you can kind of readjust and right size the funding, correct? So if you have more Cahoots programs, if you have more people like Ebony who are answering, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the police department calls, then you don't need all that funding that the police are having to put in right now, to go to every little thing, every little, loud noise complaints and things like that. So I think that's the issue at hand now. It's about right sizing the police and their role in public safety. And the idea would be that, by defunding, you do that in a way that then lowers or I guess shrinks the basically the bucket of things that the police are involved in. So then funding would then, match with what they're asked to do. And I guess the one other point I would say on that is there's actually an overlap, I think, with defund activists and police, in that police often are the first ones to say, we are not social workers, right? We are not, these mental health crisis workers. So I think that which is a lot of what activists have been calling for, is that, hey, because police are not, trained, mental health workers. These are, and anyone who's ever dealt with someone in a mental health crisis knows that it's not just something that any layperson like myself could do. You need real training and real experience in doing that. So I think there is some sort of overlap there where police probably wouldn't mind, having to do fewer of these things and kind of, maybe readjusting their focus in some way.
And Ebony, how does the Cahoots budget compare to the larger police budget in Eugene, Oregon?
We don't cost as much. The 2 million versus 68, I think, is the thing I always look at and fall back to. And we've done some calculations that tell us we've saved at least, in the calls that we handle, we saved at least $8.5 million, if based on how much each police call seems to cost, and then having us go instead. So we can do that 20% of the calls at a cheaper price point, I suppose, than they would if they were on it, simply, I think, largely in part because we use different resources. Our resources are our training and our de-escalation skills and our mental health assessment abilities, and some of these things that we know and we use once you've done them, you have them. And, we do some continuing education, and we debrief with each other and make sure that we're still practicing well, but we don't need a lot of equipment to do that. We don't need a lot of, trying really hard not to call them toys, but just stuff, right? We don't need a lot of stuff to do that work. And I think that shows in our budget. I think that we are anytime we get extra money, we buy stuff for our clients. We buy stuff for our community. We buy tents, we buy food, we buy water. Any excess goes right back into the community. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that our budgets look different, but ours is smaller and used very differently.
Thank you. And I have a question from Ayana Holmes. It says, any suggestions for motivating city officials to champion alternative public safety models?
I think showing, so at this point there's been movement and there's precedent. So I think showing examples like Minneapolis, LA, who's divested some, New York has divested some, and just, I think the broader vision is also continued reimagining, and not just okay, we divested in LA, we divested $150 million, so stop complaining and now it's all good. So I think it's seeing this as a process as opposed to a sort of an individual decision. But I think that there's precedent. I think a big one is the Berkeley example, where they voted to remove police from traffic safety, because a lot of situations spiral out because of police traffic stops. And so I think that is a model that needs to continue and spread across the country. And so, and there's precedent there. And so I think, there's a lot of emerging, examples in different things going on across the country. And I think leveraging that to say like, hey, X, Y, and Z, or hey, like the Cahoots program has been doing this, and leveraging like the different models and examples can be effective. I think the other thing is like, sort of providing like data points that help illuminate. There was the New York Times piece that was really helpful in showing like people have this conception of what police do, and this was what police actually do. And over 90% of their time is doing nothing, or something that has nothing to do with like any kind of like sort of like perceived conflict or what is defined as like crime. And, that was a helpful way to say like, okay. And I think these points, one of the things that was, that stood out to me was with the Cahoots program, around sort of like this piece around, most of the situations didn't require backup, but like the conception is like, sort of it's often different. So I think having these different examples, and also pushing the conversation around, I think there's a way like, different programs can also change and adjust to different moments, different contexts. And even in moments where it seems like, okay, police are the have the responsibility over these things, there are alternatives to even the things that seem like foreign that can provide safety intervention that don't rely on this model of policing. And so, yeah, I think the main thing, I think, is just like there's precedent here. I think that it is effective, and I think the human aspect of this is the main point, is that people are like dying and being brutalized and being assaulted, and even the kinds of violence that we can't track with data. So like being pulled over and fearing that you might die from a police encounter can be a violence that is hard to. It's a structure of violence that's hard to track, and so. But I do think that one way of that can be effective is sort of like the cost aspect, that sending out a police, police officers in a car that costs $70,000 with equipment that costs $10,000, with salaries of, that costs like, $80,000, $90,000, that model to then respond to a noise violation or to respond to or like a more serious situation that police are not able to actually deal with in a way that provides safety for everyone involved. It actually just doesn't make sense, and it's actually causing tax money and the public's money to be channeled towards in ways that it's not giving the return on the investment that it's supposed to promise. My caution around that is because I try not to focus too much on the economic aspect, because at the end of the day, this is about like people and lives and experiences. But I do think that can be one way of saying like, not only is this doing X, Y, and Z, it's also causing, over in the United States, over $100 billion spent on policing, and nearly a similar amount around incarceration. And it's the question is like, what is that doing? And I think that could be one strategy as well.
Thank you.
And can I just add just one quick thing on that? But
yeah.
like, if you look at even incarceration, like one thing that has coalesced Democrats and Republicans around, like prison reform and those types of things is the fact that Republicans, for them, it's a fiscal issue. For I think Democrats, it might be fiscal, but also kind of a social issue exactly as well. So I think, where you can find those overlaps, you can also make the same argument for policing. Like, hey, if it's not working effectively and you're spending all this money, like what's the better way to spend that? And so I think putting it in terms that, it's a very divided political landscape as we know right now, but anything that could kind of like where you could make that argument that could, appeal to both sides, I think would be one helpful thing.
Thank you. And we have a question for John from David Hernandez. It says, because public safety and racial issues are under scrutiny, the reporting on these themes is also in some ways. What is the biggest lesson you've learned as a reporter covering these topics? And also, have you found that police departments are not so inclined to talk to you because of this scrutiny? How do you get through to departments, officers, et cetera, to get information?
Biggest lesson, I mean, it's just like every day is like a new learning thing, but I think that part of it is a little bit what I was speaking to earlier, is really digging, really hard, to really understand these issues of race and public safety that are very complicated and have many levels. It's just super important to talk to, to kind of get the perspectives of people who it's harder to get to, it's easy to, to get to certain people. It's easy to do certain types of reporting. I could, when I go on a reporting trip to some city, I could easily do a lot of stuff from my, from my house here where I'm at right now and just make calls. But it's really digging deep and really understanding like the complex layers through various people and their experiences. So I think that's how you unpack these issues of race. Is you really try to understand, how deeply people are affected, especially people who you might not hear from as much, people who you might not get to as much. And I think, for me, what's also kind of helpful, and this, maybe this is just me, but like, on the one hand, yes, we do have as journalists, like, we have to like, I do think we have to bring some sort of kind of weight to not just truth telling, but also like there's also kind of a moral implication in what we do too, right? If there are things where the truth sometimes can speak to a moral issue, and to speak to like there has to be a moral clarity, I guess I should say, to the way that we tell stories. And so I think that is a super important thing, I think, in these situations. Like, if there are white supremacists who are marching, and you call them white supremacists, you say, what they're, you say, what their message are, they might want to have cloaked messages and things that they're saying, but you say what it is, you put it in that context so people see and understand, like, when something is racist, and understand like how those systems and structures work. So I think that's also a very important part of our job too, is really kind of speaking with some sort of moral clarity on these issues. You can't always just be like the independent arbiter in the middle sitting, where, and again, that is not to say that like I have to favor one side or the other, or that I have to, ignore certain views and certain realities for people, but there are certain kind of issues where we have to speak with moral clarity on, and that often means telling the truth, right? So at the end of the day, truth is still at the core of what we're doing as reporters. So I think that is probably one of the biggest things that I've learned, covering these issues of race and policing and things like that. As far as police departments, I don't think that they've become less inclined to talk, honestly. I feel like, police still do talk. They, in some ways, they might want to talk more now because they feel, that they're under attack. So I don't think that, and I think that, again, that maybe gets back to the first thing that I talk about, the things you learn about this is really talking to people and really understanding folks where they are, and getting those stories from people who are harder to get to. And part of that is even the police department sometimes, maybe it might be harder sometimes, but I think if they see that as a reporter, you're coming in and you are really sincerely trying to understand their view and kind of what the motivations are behind it. And you at least respect that and write about that, and include that in your perspectives and in how you frame pieces, where that perspective comes from. I think that gains you that respect and that trust, so that, they may not necessarily like how something ends up. They may not necessarily like how they are framed by, activists or other folks you might quote in the piece, or they might not necessarily like how you frame certain criticisms of things that they do, but they know that you're there to be like, to really understand the issue and unpack it all. So I think unpacking those complexities, I think really for me, I haven't really had much of a problem with police departments on that front.
Thank you. And that's a great place for us to end our discussion today. Thank you so much to the panelists for your insightful points and for lending us your expertise for this hour. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And shortly after, you'll receive a survey asking for feedback on this webinar and how we can make our webinars better in the future. And if you'd like to support webinars like this in the future, we greatly appreciate that. No amount is too small, and you can text 41-444 and type in CHJ for further instructions. Our survey will also include information on donating. So thank you to everybody for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.